IFS, or internal family system theory, is basically that the ego of the child develops an internal system of all of the family members in order to predict the future and in order to cooperate with the system that it depends on to survive. And so, much like we understand mirror neurons, where in order to empathize with another person, we must take the time to understand them, which means we have to take the time to reconstruct in an area of our brain called mirror neurons what it would have been like to go through life with these physical sensations, with these influences, to look up at the giants of parents and be rewarded for this and punished for that, and what types of belief systems we would develop in order to meet our human needs. In other words, we internalize the social political dynamics in the power structure we depend on in order to more accurately predict, attune, and respond to that system, regardless of how healthy or unhealthy that system is. Because there is a survival edge to understanding that system. And it's been shown that infants start to understand the system of their parents long before language, just by watching the micro movements of their parents' eyes. Meaning, if the child expresses anger and the parents' eyes get tight and hostile in response, 95% of the time, the child learns before language that anger is not okay. It's dangerous to express anger in this system because you depend on the giants to provide for you, and if they're instead feeling hostile because they're uncomfortable with their own anger, because they're Buddhists and believe that anger is bad, or whatever it is, if they're hostile towards you, your odds of survival go down, and so you will sublimate your anger and maybe try expressing the anger as hurt. If instead of saying, I'm angry that you're not doing this and this, I'm really hurt that you're not doing this, what's the response there? And there'll be a movement and an attuning process that basically mirrors the parent's pattern, the family's pattern of elevating and suppressing different parts of the psyche based on the value hierarchy, often of the culture in a larger sense, because the cult tells the parent, if your child is like this, you're a good parent. If your child is like that, you're a bad parent. The cult tells the parent, if you're like this, you're a good person. If you're like that, you're a bad person. And in for a social species, for an interconnected mammalian species, it's very important in one's need for survival, security, love, and belonging to be accepted in the circle. And the circle dictates the terms, not the individual. But it starts with the circle and goes to the parents and then goes down to the child. And, the child is seeking to attune and adapt unconsciously because it's in a dependent relationship. And that's really the first stage of development. Now, in romantic relationships, there's a reliving of the family system because as you fall in love, the initial stages of love are, again, the projection of the ideal, which was the original child's projection on the parent. Whatever the parent was, it was the big one that made things happen. It was the ideal. And so in the falling in love process, often with someone who mirrors the opposite parent in many key energetic ways, there's the falling in love with the ideal in a childlike state. And in the doing so, there's the reactivation of the family contracts and the family system. In therapy, there's also a projection of the authority figure and the parental figure. And so there's a reactivation of that family system template. And these family systems are composed of parts. So you have different ages, but you also have the internalized network of the family, where this is how the family survived. This person screamed and got attention. Then this person had a tragedy to get some attention, in that way. Then so-and-so would get angry, and then so-and-so would calm the anger down. Then so-and-so would drink, and in its roundabout, convoluted way, the wheel would wobble forward in the progression of the family system. And one has to learn one's role within the system, and that role is dictated by the system as the reward pain system. If you will play this role, there will be more benefits to, sometimes it's for the family as a whole, meaning if the child agrees to be a scapegoat in such a way that both parents don't feel so much shame. For example, if both parents are shame-based and in a sociopathic paradigm, so shame means I'm bad, and sociopathic is you get punished for being bad. It's like what we do with poor people or lower class people. You're bad, you're not as good, and we're going to punish you, meaning it's not bad, it's not painful enough that you don't have enough resources, that you're not getting the high rank. Because you're suffering, we're going to punish you, which is what makes it sociopathic. You go into a bank and you have $5 million in your account, they'd love to give you a loan. You go into a bank and you say, my house is going to be foreclosed. My husband's got a medical injury. I've got to stay home and can't work. We really need a loan. And the bank kicks you out the door because you're hurting. In other words, it's a sociopathic paradigm where the more you reveal your need, the more you are attacked. And so in shame-based sociopathic systems, it is incredibly traumatic to acknowledge your human mistakes. In an individual cult, America is the cult of the individual, and it's dogmatic in the sense that there are no individuals without parents and groups, and you can spot an American just about anywhere on the planet because they're being very individualistic. But if everyone is doing that, and everyone is not doing that from China, can you really say that if an American hadn't been born, had been born in China, if they wouldn't have been family-oriented, but the reason they're being individual is because they were born in America? In other words, it's a cult of the individual. in which everyone focuses on the individual as a cult agreement to the exclusion of the family, to the exclusion of the whole. It's about finding me. And the trouble with being shame-based in an individual cult that is sociopathic is that everything that goes wrong is presumed to be the individual. And this creates an incredible pressure of the shame-based, isolated, fearful, traumatized individual American. And when you point out the mistakes, the incompetence, which is not at all about the individual, meaning you can go cradle to grave in the American cult. You can go through kindergarten, middle school, high school, college, get a degree, get a job, advance in the career, retire and die without a single hour of competent parental literacy, without a single hour of emotional literacy. Meaning what we learn by osmosis in sociopathic bullying cults and dominance hierarchy, this is not emotional literacy. This is sociopathic dogma that's passed on unconsciously, specifically so that it cannot be questioned. Because shame-based cults don't like to acknowledge how much they don't know. They don't even know how much they don't know, and they don't want to go into that either. So you'd really have to say, if you ask an individual, why is it that you're abusing yourself? Well, you could then ask, why does your cult abuse you by setting you up to fail in this way, this way, and this way? For example, go in and have relationships following faulty role models and have zero emotional and relational literacy. Just go make it work. Meaning, if your cult put pilots into planes and said, go fly those planes without any experience, meaning it just took random people and said, go fly these 747s, and if they managed to get them off the ground by sheer luck or trial and error, then 99% of them crashed and died. We wouldn't blame the pilots, the people who were stuck in those planes. We'd say, you fucked up morons. What on earth are you doing, putting people into pilot chairs with zero training? Now, the same could be said for parents. We talk about parental abuse, sexual abuse, you name it. And, we say, why are you abusing these children? What's wrong with you? Because it's the cult of the individual. But what's far more intelligent to ask is, what's wrong with a cult who understands that there is systemic intergenerational abuse that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, who understands that the research has been done, but we're not actually going to instruct our parents in any kind of institutional way. There will be no science on the best parental practices that year based on results, how children who grow up, what's the success rate in this area and this area. We're not going to do any of that. We're just going to say it's hard and life's a bitch. Well, we could still be doing that with 747 planes. It's just that we care more about capital than we do about human beings, and so we would never just throw random people into a pilot seat on a $200 million plane. But hey, if it's just a baby, who gives a shit? I mean, they're drunk. They probably shouldn't have been married. You know, he beats her up every time. I'm sure the child will survive with a 95% chance of developing complex PTSD and addiction and all that. But, well, you know, what else is new? You know, and so you have an incredibly incompetent and juvenile cult, which of course doesn't want to take a shame-based cult, does not want to say, we don't know what the fuck we're doing. And so it passes the shame on to the individual. You know, we're the great America, we're the great this and that, we're the number one at something or other. Inciting terror, obesity, I'm sure we're number one at something. But let's pass that all on to the individual. Let's shame them for our institutional incompetency. And that shame, you know, when the incompetent parent, of course, hits the child when they lose it. And they lose it because they haven't learned competent parenting. They haven't learned competent parenting because they didn't have any. And no one's responding to that obvious situation. And so, you know, there's the hitting of the child, which communicates that you will be punished if you do it wrong. The cult will not be punished for its stupidity and its cruelty and its willful ignorance and, you know, being completely unscientific around parenting and psychology and relationships. No. We won't in any way question the cult. We'll just question the individual. And you can even have, you know, as we love to do in our cult, we take children to psychologists and doctors, and we diagnose the child. We don't diagnose the family. You know, the child has nightmares and wets their bed and does this and that, the other, and the doctor takes notes and gives fancy Latin names. It basically takes all the data. The child gets angry at their parent. Oh, angry defiant disorder. The parent pays the bill for that, just to turn the symptoms into Latin or just a fancy name. Now they can both say, okay, you, the child, not the parents, not the family, not the cult. You've been born bad, you know, and here's your list of your faults. Now, the transference of shame onto the child in a shame-based family makes the parents feel better. And if they feel better about themselves enough, they'll stay in the marriage. They won't leave, they won't commit suicide, they won't, you know. And so if a child grasps that their parent is literally, you know, carrying so much shame and incompetence from a shame-based, incompetent, sociopathic cult, that they cannot hold another piece of accurate data about how incompetent they are. They desperately need an outlet, and their boss isn't going to take it. And the neighbors aren't going to take it. And the government certainly isn't going to take it. You know, try calling the government and saying, you know, I'm an American citizen, and I'm having a hard time in this country. People are afraid of me because they don't know me. And that's what they say. They say, I don't know you. It's like, yeah, I'm trying to introduce myself. No, I don't know you. Get out, go away. It's like, well, how are you going to get to know me if you reject me because you don't know me? I mean, obviously you don't know me, and you never will, because you're rejecting me because you don't know me. So how's that going to work? Like, I've got a hard problem with the American cult. Can you help? You know, you got some person on the other end, absolutely clueless. I'm sorry, we don't help with things like that. Try writing a letter. I remember doing that when I first came back in the country. It's like, what do I do as a citizen here and there? They didn't even reply. So it all gets thrown back on the individual. Well, the children can sense the body language, the eye movements, the tone of voice, the breaking point of an identity. And so one of them agrees to, it's all my fault. I'm terrible, I'm bad. Oh, what a relief. What a relief. It's not Dad's fault. It's not the cult's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's a 6-year-old child. It's all their fault. And every time you feel frightened of being punished, you can punish that 6-year-old. But the 6-year-old has saved the family. Because without that safety valve of saying, I'll be the complete dumping bag for all of your hatred, and I'll say it's all me. Look at me, I'm bad, I'm doing it again. In fact, you need to vent. Let me go do something bad so that you can have a good excuse to vent, because you're about to blow, and if you blow at Mom again, she's going to leave you. And I won't have a container. So let me distract you and divert and ground all of your hate and all of your rage and all of your doubt. And I'll do it really simply. I'll do it in a way that makes you feel really justified and clear what the problem is. It's me. And then you feel better, and the family stays together. And the wobbly wheel survives another week, another month. And that child saved the family. It kept things intact. When my father was dealing with his shame and his rage and anger, etc., he couldn't bond with anyone except in shame. So by the time I was 4, I began copying his abuse. And when I woke up and, I think it was like 5 or so before I was really aware of myself. And then I stopped. It's like, I don't want to be an abuser. But I recognized, my father's able to emotionally bond with me if we're both shame-based people. But it's the only connection I can have with him. Now, how do I make it safe for him to bond with me? I have to do some bad things. And then we're connected. We've got a bond. We're both shame-based people. And that was the first moment when I had a connection with my father. And from that moment on, I would go out of my way to appear deviant because it brought us closer together. But it was a pretense, meaning it didn't feel very real. But I liked the contact with my father. And the reason I think this understanding of parts and templates and internalized family is very important to understand is it's going on constantly at high, but in unconscious ways. One of the reasons that I introduced my 10-hour interview prior to being sexual with a high, someone associated with high and other lovers as well, was that having sex with someone is one of the ways to trigger the family system and the contract. In other words, what I was very clear on was that women would not tell me the truth statistically, meaning a few would, but you couldn't tell up front. Would a woman tell me the truth after we had sex and she'd triggered attachment hormones. Because a lot of what would happen is once there's the attachment, that now she's looking at my face and trying to tell me what I want to hear or what she thinks I want to hear, and panicking if it's not working, as opposed to just being herself and saying, well, I like this and I like that, and then I can say, well, I'm not that way at all, and so you probably won't enjoy this relationship, and we can go our separate ways, or we can negotiate. But it's outside the system. We're dealing with the rational mind. Whereas once you trigger the attachment dynamics or fall in love, we're now dealing with the contracts and the family system, which in many cases, in some cases women more than men, I'm not sure quite what the statistic is, but now means that in order to be loved, you've got to please and do and say the right thing. Otherwise, the love is withdrawn. And that's very much the dynamic around the therapeutic relationship with Peter Sandhill and then subsequently Ann Watts. Because, Peter entered the terrain by being very generous towards my little boy. And he escalated that terrain by making, a very profound promise. He used the example of Gandalf on the stone cross where the Balrog. Now, the Balrog is a symbol of the ancient beast. It's the reptilian brain, and it's the terrain of trauma. The Balrog is what emerges out of the unconscious in it, the entire nature, the fire, etc. You've got the reptilian brain, and you've got fear, and you have death. And what Gandalf does to the company that's crossing the chasm in the Mines of Moria in the Lord of the Rings trilogy is he tells the people on the fellowship, you go on. I, the oldest one, the parent, the elder, I will face death. I will face the reptilian brain. I will die defending you. And he ends up being taken down into the chasm as the tail whips up, and he faces his deepest fears, his deepest pain. He descends into the reptilian brain. And in Gandalf's journey, he transcends. He comes out Gandalf the White. He comes out as a spiritual adult, the one who has faced death to protect the innocent. It's a mystical moment. And Peter Sandhill promised to take that stand for my little boy if only I would agree to take this very high psychedelic dose. My body was not at all comfortable with it. But my little boy is like, I'd be nice to finally have, a dad, who would actually show up and not throw me into the abyss, because that's what regressed, traumatized parents do, is they get close to the abyss themselves. They realize they don't know what they're doing if they fall in the abyss. They're afraid they won't survive. They're desperate to avoid the memories of their own early childhood trauma, so they throw their children into the abyss. And it distracts them from those terrors and pains. And so, we are a cult of regressed children and adolescents, of traumatized regressed children and adolescents who either can't admit that they did anything wrong, or take on the entire blame and shame of the universe and collapse and won't stand up as parents. Both are terrifying for a child because they're depending on these giants to survive. And one of them is making a complete muck of things and pretending like they're doing everything perfectly. And the other one is collapsing at the, you can't even tell them, Mom, you're late again. Oh, I'm such a horrible mother. I can never do anything right. And is wailing for 2 or 3 hours. And it's like, we can't tell the truth to Mom or she just collapses. We can't tell the truth to Dad. He immediately shuts down and has a fit and punishes us all, and etc. Until we'll be the wrong ones. We're so sorry, Dad. We got in your way while you were doing this and that. We shouldn't have run in front of your gun when you were busy shooting in the backyard. It's like it's all my fault. And so it's basically a defense system that is necessary for the child to feel like there's someone who knows what they're doing and who's got my back. And so I'm going to prop you up so that I can at least sustain that illusion by making myself the scapegoat and feeling bad. And so I was doing the normal scapegoating thing and going along with Peter as I had in the earlier round of when he was expressing sexual interest in me 10 years prior. But then the psychedelic hit, and it hit hard because he'd insisted on a high dose. And that's when the truth started to come out. Not the making Peter look good and projecting all that onto the perfect parent who had promised to be there, but the first thing out of my mouth was, gee, you really, really hurt me by coming on to me in a therapeutic session 10 years prior. It scared me, it confused me, it overwhelmed me, it hurt me. And Peter pushed that aside. And so now began a battle between the truth that Peter had induced with the insistence on the psychedelic session and Peter's inability to process the fact that he didn't know what he was doing, which he didn't. He didn't know it 10 years ago, and he didn't know it then, and he doesn't know it now. But, again, in an individual cult that is sociopathic, where you punish people when they fail, and it's shame-based, where if you make a mistake, you are a mistake, Peter cannot process this. But the trap is to get stuck on Peter, because the entire high facilitator body cannot process this. And so, in my family of origin, I took on more and more shame, more and more pain, more and more of just all the fear, all this stuff, to bring to make my parents' incompetency invisible enough to try and sideline that off, so that they wouldn't feel so shitty about themselves that either they would, go on rage rampages or, just dissolve or go insane and all of that type of madness. And they needed that and have maintained their kind of view of being largely perfect people, etc. And when are you going to realize this and all that? But it kept them together. And I just left and let them continue to do that to my younger siblings. And I tried to keep the High family together by not confronting this type of dynamic. But this time, because the abuse happened at, a 10x to 100x higher impact, because the psychedelic compounds bypass the objector protector And so Peter was able to get in really close and have a lot of destructive impact with his blindness and, all of his shame that he was asking me to carry. The joke of it was a little too much, because he's asking me to carry his lies, his secrets, his lusts, his shame, his blindness and stupidity. But that's not enough for Peter. He needs me to pay for it. And he needs me to go crazy and pretend that it's not happening. And he needs to fight the healthy voice in me that he's paid to facilitate, but he's actually battling. And as this goes south, and then he needed to add his psychic powers onto that and have me marry one of the most incompatible people imaginable. And he couldn't be wrong about that either. And I kept trying to go along with that to maintain the bond with a father figure. I spent $60,000 pursuing that marriage kind of dynamic alone. And Peter could never be wrong. He still isn't wrong today. He's very unfairly treated as his anonymous friends who call up and harangue his victims can attest. It's outrageous what you're doing to Peter Sandhill. See, it's not outrageous what a therapist is doing to a patient they've sexually abused. That's just, it's just normal stuff, right? It was also never outrageous when talking with people about, the parental abuse. They were a bit indignant, it's like, you should be grateful for your parents. You should learn to understand your parents' point of view. These people never went to my parents and said, it's outrageous what you're doing. Why are your children having to talk to me? You need to learn to understand your child. No. See, that would have been awkward. That would have been risky for these little children in grown-up bodies. So instead, they're trying to shame the child for not being able to do what they can't do and what the parent can't do. But surely a 10-year-old ought to be able to understand the parent. I mean, we all know why the parent can't understand the 10-year-old, but surely a 10-year-old could understand. And this incredible split, we see it in the Trump presidency as well. Everyone has to understand Trump because he can't make a mistake. He can't lose because he's an abused child, because Fred Trump had no parental competency. And the world has largely rewarded the kind of bravado and lies and stuff that Trump has built an empire on, because we have so much faith in that, because it worked for Dad. Why, Trump's just doing it on a larger scale to let all of us analyze the moving parts of our family system. Dad got away with it. Trump's just like Dad. So let's vote for him. He seems to be succeeding and pulling off the charade. And that's what the little boy wants, in some ways, security, familiarity, a contract of abuse that I understand. But at some point, the abuse got too much. At some point, the pain got too deep. And I said, no, this isn't personal. I won't take this personal. But it's profoundly incompetent. It is so incompetent, it would be better that High shut down rather than perpetuate this as love. In other words, it would be better for the family to break up than for the healthiest parts of the family to hold on to all the fear. You see, when I brought to Ann Watts later on in the process and said, we need to tell the community, that was sane, that was public safety, that was health. That's responsibility. But that's when Ann Watts, it's the only time I've seen her angry and scared at the same time. She gave me a little lecture. Why do I need to be the one to tell the community? Who do you think you are? I'm your client, Ann. The one you have a primary ethical responsibility to protect, and so is all the community. They have the right to make an informed decision. But what Ann was really communicating to me at that point is I not only have to lose one therapist, I have to lose two therapists. In fact, I have to lose the entire facilitator body because they cannot process their inadequacy in this terrain. The amount of shame, punishment, fear that is unresolved in the facilitator body is too big for them to process openly and do their roles in this terrain. And so, like Peter, they offered me the contract. You pretend that it was all your fault. You pretend that you should never have. Anne even said in one of our little, I met with her in her house. We're listening to a session where we're like 4 hours into it. Peter has really pushed hard that I take this high mushroom for my first experience. Then he, in a 30-minute period, he twice suggested, you want to take some MDMA? I didn't respond. 30 minutes later, again, how about some MDMA? On top of your dissociative high experience, right? I take the MDMA, I promptly fall in love with Peter because my objector protector completely bypassed, and I'm just in this, radiant light, energy where there's no fear because the chemical has bypassed all of that. And I fall in love with Peter Sandhill and invite him, into a lover's embrace and how much I love you and we're kissing and all. And Anne's listening to that and she's saying, you seduced him. She's blaming a chemically induced patient of hers for seducing her colleague in a paid therapeutic session because she can't deal with her responsibility if it flips. And look, Anne, you were the last person to recommend Peter. You trained him, you chose him. You didn't disclose he didn't have a license. You didn't ask when I began working with you after the first round of abuse. You didn't say, why did you switch away from Peter? Did my colleague do anything wrong? You were willfully ignorant about this, and you can't process that. And so I've lost the family basically by switching survival strategy, meaning I played the scapegoat, week one, I'm the wrong one, all of this, as far as I could go until it nearly killed me. And I'm begging them, please see reason. Please, can you carry a little bit more of this? And they carried a little bit more. Just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more here and there. But it still left me carrying the bulk of their fear, the bulk of their shame, etc. And going through PTSD, trying to learn all what was happening. It was just terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I needed them to actually own their shit so that I could deal with my shit because it was reenacting the whole family thing, which in good psychedelic therapy you re-examine your family abuse in a safe therapeutic setting. This was the opposite. This was all of your therapists do to you what your family had done and punish you and banish you and let you know all the love will be withdrawn if you tell the truth. And that's exactly what happened. The email list cut off, no this, no acknowledgement, no refund, no this. You're just cut off from the family because you didn't do your role. You started telling the truth. Now the problem is, that's a healthy maturation process and and movement towards adulthood when if you don't have regressed trauma. But this stirred up regressed trauma, and so a lot of this whole journey I was going through as a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old can't deal with the dissolution of high, the conflict, any of that. Anne's mom, Peter's dad. I need them to be together. I need to be held. So I'll take as much of this as I can. So a lot of this was that balancing point. And it's very, very, for most of the last 4 years, I have felt like I would die if I talked like this. That's the 5-year-old recognizing that if I had not held the shame, the incompetence, the abuse of my parents, the fear of my parents, that they would have split up or abandoned me or attacked each other, and I would die, or at least suffer extreme trauma. And so I'd taken that on. Peter had invited the reenactment of the abuse. I'd happily signed the contract as a 5-year-old. I'll go along with this, and Peter, you're Mr. Wonderful. It's just the wounds were too deep. I couldn't live in Peter's delusions of grandeur in the face of such pitiful incompetency. And so that's the tearing up of the contract, but it's also the loss of the false family, meaning a group of therapists in a school that demands that you take on all of their incompetence and ignorance and call it love and wonderful and all this. That's very unhealthy. But it is better than nothing in many ways. It's like we're a social species, and there's a mixed bag. My parents weren't all bad. They weren't all incompetent, so it's a mixed bag. High is not all bad, it's not all incompetent. It's a mixed bag. But you cannot become an adult and hold these contracts. And I hadn't become an adult. I was still looking for some parent that would release me of this contract, but therapists have their own stuff. So, what I can say is that my little boy, my 5-year-old, experienced the terror as Peter promptly threw him in the chasm. And I went and go through PTSD as a terrified 5-year-old so that Peter can run off. He wasn't Gandalf that protected the child. He was Peter who ran off and left the child there. And Peter's facade of, warm glow and all of that migrated into all of his self-hatred, which didn't help me at all. It doesn't. It didn't. It doesn't now. The parts of Peter that cannot love Peter as he is do not help. The rage and anger his adolescent age is directed, anyone throwing it, that doesn't help me at all either. The only thing that helps is an adult in response to my inner child and in response to their inner child. That's the only thing that helps. And because High was going through survival crisis around the fire at Harbin, and because any sane person would acknowledge that, or at least heavily question, should high be existing if its facilitators repeatedly sexually abuse a client and ask them to pay for it, and then blame them for it, and then cover it up? That's pretty systemic. And then the entire board stonewalls, and Desiree Storch, who used to be my bookkeeper, wouldn't tell me the email addresses of the board. It's like, no, we don't want to be punished. We don't want to be punished for our mistake. So we're going to shame and bury the client, which escalates the crime, 50 times or so, because now everyone else is at risk, and you're punishing the one person who needs the most support. So, I've gone through the flames and still go through those death and trauma and dissociation and terror and loneliness, and I'm still learning to love that little boy because I've never met the father who can, and so I haven't been able to internalize that. That's what was so appealing about Peter's promise and why I followed him into so many weird corridors was, at the end was this promise of being loved as a little boy. But Peter, of course, can't do that to my little boy if he can't do it to his own. And so, in many ways, in the system, in the family system of high, I am first the scapegoated, willing scapegoat, that ran energy. And even in workshops, I would be in the circle and at times feel overloaded with energy and stuff. And I would leave the room and I would decide I'm left the workshop, and all the energy would lift. And I'd say, oh, I see. Most of that wasn't really mine. That was the dynamic of my role in that circle. And all this stuff that's coming up with me, sensitives often do carry the stuff that other people are uncomfortable with. And there'll be the pressure relief for that, often the scapegoat in various ways. But there are various times the room was incredibly unhealthy because there was so much denied energy in the room, which is exactly what a sensitive tunes into, is the denied energy, because that's one of their roles in the family system, is to pick all the buildup of denied energy and funnel it and be the expression of that, because that makes everyone else feel comfortable, because now the odd feeling is externalized and can be pointed at and then isolated and judged out there as opposed to in here. The benefits of breaking this contract and slowly learning to parent myself are enormous, because the healthiest parts of myself have been playing this rescuer role of carrying other people's shame, and in order to make them feel comfortable in the hope of being loved. But that's not really love. It's just survival and security. And so, what's blossoming on the other side is the success, the vision, the insight, the recharacterization from scapegoat into vision. The vision that was frightening and feared by my parents, was frightened and feared by my school. My teacher, I remember, had a complete meltdown and rage when I was bringing insight to certain things, because it revealed his incompetence in front of the class. So after he raged at a sensitive and just complete hatred and stuff, this was at Waldorf school. It means absolutely nothing. You can be in the room of love, you can be at Waldorf schools, you can be at Findhorn. None of those address these deeper traumatic roles and parts. That's very, very unusual, deep inner work, which a stranger at McDonald's is as likely to do as someone at High or Findhorn. And so, part of the coping, I guess, masking mechanisms is to create all these grandiose labels. They mean absolutely nothing. One of the two most helpful people I met in the entire process were Thai women who didn't speak English, but who were adults and who could feel the pain and the grief and just being, and they didn't run from the feeling or give me more of theirs. They sat with me and held space. It's very rare. They had no degrees. They were both, one was rich, one was poor. Financially, it's nothing to do with anything other than being able to hold and be with the self, which is very hard to do when you grow up in a family that is so terrified of, my father was terrified of himself, and my mother was terrified of herself. They were both terrified of their feelings. So anytime I would bring feelings into the relationship, they would be terrified because they'd start to feel things. And they both begged me in so many facial expressions over so many years, please, please, don't be real. Don't feel. You'll have feelings, and then we'll have feelings, and they're going to kill us. And so the confusing message for a child is, okay, I can shut down my feelings, but what is so terrifying about my feelings? I don't think they're going to kill you. They're going to kill us. They're going to kill me. Don't get away. Get away with those feelings. We're going to hit you if you come with us. Get away. So I was like, okay. I'm not sure what's so terrifying there. But, just seeing all the people around you is the same with High. It's like, what is so terrifying about the truth? You made a mistake. I'm not trying to hurt you, but I need to integrate this. And you can't ask me to go crazy in my own psychedelic session and pay you to make me crazy because you can't deal with your incompetency. You can be incompetent, but you have to admit it. And once Peter escalated the love relationship, the biggest joke today is there's been no cheerful refund, which makes it the biggest slam dunk imaginable. Because Peter can't give a cheerful refund and say, how can I help pay for extra therapy? Because it would admit that he didn't do a good job. Of course he didn't do a good job. High didn't teach him to do a good job. He had no experience in psychedelic training. What High taught Peter was grandiosity. We're committed to the whole world winning. We're the room of love and this and that. And he bought into it. Like everyone who's misguided. And so, of course, he didn't know what he was doing. It doesn't mean he's fundamentally bad. It just means he was rewarded for behaving destructively and cannot grapple with the pivot because he still has a lot of enablers in his life, as he'll be, all these people who agree with his point of view. These lies are ultimately more costly and dangerous than facing the shame and dealing with the truth of these incompetencies. These lies will kill the organization, not the truth. And yet, many people get a divorce because they can't face this. And so this is our challenge, each of us. This is, Trump played it out for the nation. Thank you, Trump, for revealing the extreme damage that we do to ourselves when we abuse our children, traumatize our children, shame our children, don't heal any of it, don't teach emotional literacy in school, don't hold parents accountable. And then people grow up and have to take some positions of power and, of course, do all that abuse to everyone else. Thank you, Trump, for pointing that out. And we can thank the High facilitators for understanding they're doing exactly what we do in our cult. lying to ourselves, lying to themselves, lying to ourselves, to protect from being punished, from our mistakes that are not innate to us, they're innate to the cult. It takes lots of skill and effort to overcome the innate dogma of a sociopathic cult, which is also crazy, so it can't admit that it's sociopathic. That's got to be, no, we're not a sociopathic cult. So we're sociopathic, but we're so sociopathic we ask everyone to go crazy rather than deal. What is more sociopathic than giving tens of millions of dollars in loans to billionaires, but we can't even spare $50,000 when you're nursing a sick husband at home? That's not empathy. What is it? Or bullying the weakest child in school. That's not empathy. Or dumping all the shame on the scapegoat, who's usually the most sensitive one. That's not empathy. Or cutting the abused therapeutic patient off of the email list, the one person who needs the most support. We'll cut him off. Why? Because of our fear. We don't want the word to get out. It's not empathy. It's profoundly cruel. It is vicious. But can we accept the vicious parts of ourselves without punishing them? That's a very difficult thing, because that's really what we like to do, is say we're not vicious at all, but when we have to acknowledge some horrible thing is happening, okay, fine. This person is vicious. We're not vicious. This person. You look at the serial killers that we love to put to death. They're usually some of the most traumatized, abused people around. But nobody takes responsibility and says, wow, we are fucked up. We took an innocent child and turned him into you? Systematically? Another one? My goodness, we don't know what we're doing. We never say that. Hitler. Hitler. If we could have just killed Hitler. How about if we had just brought one adult parent into Hitler's life and let him know that all of his parts were lovable? Anyone think of that? No, because that would be empathic. We're fear, shame-based, sociopathic. And then we're afraid of being caught in that because that sounds bad. And so we're insane, which is even worse. It doesn't mean we have to be punished because we're that fucked up. It means we need an adult, someone, somewhere, anywhere, an adult, inside or out, to love the parts that are so terrified in a reptilian environment.